It's the International Soccer Preview. We are Soccerphiles Canada. We're looking at World Cup 2026 qualifying in the Asian region. This is round one, the preliminary round. Our third pairing is Singapore versus Guam. Here we go. It's the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada, Series 21. I'm Kevin, and today we will continue the beginning of a massive set of series looking at World Cup 2026 qualifying. Series 21 will cover 3 rounds of qualifying for the Asian region, or the AFC, and this is the third of 10 media casts covering the preliminary round of qualifying. These are the bottom 20 teams in the AFC region playing home and away, the 10 winners advancing to the second round. This is set 3 of 10 then, covering Singapore versus Guam. Yeah, and we've been wanting to cover the weaker countries in world soccer because they get little attention. Most media casts focus on the big teams, but these small teams have an interesting history too. However, some of them never get on the radar because they're often knocked out in early rounds. In addition, they're often hard to separate in the minds of even ardent soccer fans because they just clump into a nebulous category of weak teams. Part of the goal here then is to make them more distinct. Throughout, we'll be mentioning the teams that they beat or the teams that usually beat them. And we name them on purpose so that fans can, little by little, build an impression of how strong each team is relative to those around them. At this point, we usually give some information about our past, present, and future media casts. However, we don't want too much information in our introduction here, so we've made a separate media cast that covers what we've been doing recently and what we plan to cover over the next 9 months or so. So that'll be published around October 15th, 2023, and can also be found at the addresses that YouTube watchers can see on the graphic here, and also we'll give a link to that in the show notes. All right, on with the show here then. So we're going to cover the third of 10 preliminary pairings here, and for each team we will have 3 sections. So in part 1 we'll introduce a bit about the 2 teams competing, the 2 countries I should say, their location and population. Part 2 is the main part of the media cast here, and we'll do an overview of each team's soccer history, their World Cup, Regional Cup, and Local Cup, which I'll talk about shortly, as well as their recent form. So this series features a deep dive into each team's history in World Cup qualifying. The Asian region is further divided into what we call localities, and these play a big role in Asia. So part 2 touches on this often neglected aspect of the team's history, or I should say part of part 2. Part 3 will be a comparison of the 2 teams in their rankings, head-to-head records and odds, and we'll end with a discussion of their prospects and our prediction for this preliminary round. Okay, let's jump on into it. And we'll take a look at the first team, Singapore. Well, Singapore is an island city-state and the smallest country in terms of land size in Southeastern Asia. It is located on the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. It's south of the Malaysian state of Johor and north of the Indonesian Riau Islands. So it is a population of just 6 million people, so actually quite a big population given its size. But it's 114th in the world and 36th in Asia, 36 out of 51. Our next team, Guam, is a territory of the USA, and it is the largest and southernmost of the Mariana Islands. Well, the Mariana Islands are really in the middle of the Pacific Ocean there. And Guam has 173,000 people. So, oh, actually, I said 51 teams in Asia. I guess it's 52nd because Guam is 52nd, or the smallest of the soccer nations there in the Asian region. And it's 192nd in the world. I think that's out of about 210 countries or so. 173,000 people. Okay, let's move on to part two, and we begin with an overview of the team's participation and strength. And Singapore has a long history entering the Asian Cup in its second edition in 1960. Participation was quite patchy, though, until 1992, and from that time they've joined consistently. They joined the World Cup much later, 18 years later in 1978, and in that competition they've never failed to complete a qualification. Their local group is the AFF, or the ASEAN Football Federation. That's an acronym within an acronym. ASEAN stands for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So Singapore's first competition was in 1996. That was the first time the Cup was played, and it takes place about every 2 years, and Singapore has entered all editions of that tournament. In terms of strength, Singapore is a third-tier team. Their average result is third place in the semi-final round of World Cup qualifying and in Asian Cup qualifying groups. Only once have they risen above this, though, but they have many times fallen short of it with a last place finish even. Even their impressive wins of the local AFF title does not lift them above third tier, as there are no second tier teams in that Southeast Asian region. The odd result over a higher team is expected, but Singapore is more likely, especially in recent times, to drop points to a fourth tier team. Okay, so let's take a bit of a zoom in on the World Cup here. In World Cup qualification, they always make it to the semi-final group stage, and until 2026 have received a bye in the preliminary round if there is one. Their best performance was their first campaign, a second-place finish in their 1978 group, where they advanced to a playoff to reach the final round, but lost. Otherwise, they finished in the middle to the bottom of the table, with a particularly poor run from 1998 to 2006, where they suffered 3 last-place finishes in a row. And we'll go into a bit more detail as the deep dive features their World Cup qualification. We'll move on now to an overview of their regional cup, or the Asian Cup. And as a third-tier team, Singapore should make the odd appearance in the Asian Cup. However, they have qualified only once, and that was only by dint of hosting it in 1984. There they finished 4th of 5 in the group stage. They otherwise came close to qualifying in a good period from 1996 to 2000, coming second in their qualifying group both times. This was ironically the start of their weakest period in World Cup history, which we mentioned before. Their weak period in Asian Cup history really was 2011 to 2019, where they finished last in the qualifying group there 3 times in a row. Okay, let us take a look at their local cup. If somewhat inconsistent in their World and Asian Cup campaigns, their record in the local Southeast Asian group is shockingly so. Disregarding a semi-final finish in 2008, their record over the other 8 editions from 1996 to 2012 is 4 group stage knockouts, paired alongside 4 title wins. They are second only to Thailand in the number of titles won, but are currently a cut behind the other third-tier teams in the region, and those are Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia. They've been knocked out of the group stage in 4 of the last 5 editions. Okay, and now we move on to our deep dive. That is qualifying for the World Cup finals, or qualifying for the World Cup finals in detail. So their first and best performance, as we've mentioned, was in 1978. The semi-final round saw them finish 1 point behind Hong Kong, but ahead of the other top Southeast Asian nations. In a quirky system, the top two finishers played off for a spot in the final round. But despite hosting the game, Singapore lost to Hong Kong, and with it went their best opportunity to reach the final round. 1982 and 1986 saw them meeting Japan and North Korea in both editions. Despite a win over a still weak Japan in 1982 and a tie with North Korea in 1986, they finished last in the group in both. 1990 would prove a typical result similar to their current strength. They were no match for winner South Korea and were bested by Malaysia, who finished ahead of them. But they twice beat Nepal to finish third of four in the group. Actually, India was also in that group, but had withdrawn. In 1994, they had a strong campaign. They lost twice to North Korea, but otherwise they lost only away to Qatar. Hosting the second half of the tournament saw them finish third of five, just a point behind Qatar, but well ahead of local rivals Indonesia and Vietnam. And that was followed by the period we mentioned, a weak period from 1998 to 2006. In the first of these, a single draw with Lebanon saw them finish last in a group of three. Kuwait were the winners there. They tied Kuwait in 2002, but otherwise only tied Kyrgyzstan to finish last in a group of four. And in 2006, a single win over India left them last for the third campaign in a row. They passed two initial rounds in 2010, and they reached the semi-final round as always. There they did well to beat Lebanon twice, finishing ahead of them in third place, but far behind Saudi Arabia and Uzbekistan. 2014 was disappointing. After knocking out Malaysia to reach the semi-final round, they lost all games to Iraq, Jordan, and China for their only recent last place finish. And 2018 began well as they tied Japan away and lost only one of their first five games. However, they lost the last three, including a final game loss in Afghanistan, and finished third, which is their standard result. And we will take a look at the 2022 campaign in close detail in our next section, actually, as we move on to their recent history. So we're going to cover all the way from the Asian Cup in 2019 here up until their current or their last tournament. So 2018 World Cup qualifying made up the first two rounds of qualification for the 2019 Asian Cup. Their third of five finish behind Syria, but ahead of Afghanistan, saw them through to round 3 of 3. And there they started well with a draw in Bahrain, but earned only one other draw at home to Turkmenistan. Losing twice here to Chinese Taipei really was a disgrace, and they finished last in the group, well behind Chinese Taipei, in fact. So not a good campaign there, and we move on to their next campaign, which is the local cup in the AFF, or the Southeast Asian region. And unlike the previous edition, they beat Philippines to finish second in the group stage, but behind Thailand, who they lost to. But second place was good enough to get them to the semi-finals. And they tied both legs with Indonesia, and so the matter went to extra time. But Indonesia scored twice there and knocked them out at the semi-final stage. So not a bad performance in their region there. We move on now to their next campaign, the World Cup in 2022, or World Cup qualifying. So they were not one of the bottom ranked 12 teams required to play in the preliminary round. They came in as the fifth seed into the second round in their 5-team qualifying group. And so they did well to tie Yemen, and even better to tie Palestine. Those were both in home games, the first 2 home games. They would eventually best Yemen to finish 4th in the semi-final round, but they lost all other games, including those to group winner Saudi Arabia and second place finishers Uzbekistan, meeting those two for a second campaign, actually. So it was a 4th of 5 place finish there. And the next tournament is the local cup again in 2022. So they did well to tie Vietnam at home, but they lost on the road to Malaysia to finish behind both of them. 3rd of 5 in a group stage there, ahead of weaker teams Myanmar and Laos. So knocked out at the group stage. And we finished with the Asian Cup. We've looked at the first 2 rounds in 2022 World Cup qualifying. So those 2 rounds factor in here. And we saw that they received a bye in the first round and were kind of competitive with Yemen and Palestine, but finished between them. Palestine ahead and Yemen behind for a 4th place finish in the group. But that was enough to qualify them for round 3 of 3. For the Asian Cup, and in that round they lost the first 2 games to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and a 6-2 win over Myanmar in the 3rd game didn't help them at all. So it was 3rd of 4 in the group and no passage through to the 2023 Asian Cup. All right, well, that is the end of Singapore, and we move on to take a look at Guam, starting with an overview of their participation and strength. So Guam first entered the World Cup in 2002, and so are one of the youngest teams in the world, actually. They withdrew from the next 2 editions, though, and they didn't enter in 2014. They returned in 2018 and have participated in the last 2 tournaments. The Asian Cup participation is better, but it's patchy. They entered this competition a lot earlier quite a bit earlier, 6 years earlier, in 1996. And here they completed all campaigns until 2008. By this time, they were playing in the Challenge Cup rather than the Asian Cup, and that's a tournament for the weaker teams in Asia, kind of in lieu of the Asian Cup. And in 2010 and 2012, they they did not enter the competition, and they returned in 2014. And then in 2019, all teams returned to a reformatted Asian Cup, and Guam again withdrew here, but they have been consistent in recent campaigns. Well, you can't call one campaign consistent, so they did join in 2023. So in this light, their consistency and participation hasn't been that good, but in local competition, it's quite impressive. They're part of the East Asian Football Federation, or the EAFF, and they've participated on all 9 editions from 2003 to 2022. In terms of strength, Guam's early years would actually require a new tier to define. The 5th tier is the lowest and is characterized by losing almost all games and providing no threat at the campaign level to other teams. But Guam was losing by large score lines even to those 5th tier teams. One can only wince at the humiliation, and it's no surprise they dropped out of competition until they could improve. They didn't drop out of the local competition, though, as we've seen, and through that, perhaps, they built themselves into at least a competitive 5th tier team. They returned to the World Cup in 2018 and put in a performance actually worthy of a 4th tier team, but that didn't last, and they're currently a team competitive only with other 5th tier teams. Okay, getting a bit deeper into their history, their World Cup overview. Again, their first campaign in 2002, but it was a traumatic one. Though it was only 2 games, they suffered humiliating double-digit losses in both, which we'll take a look at in the deep dive. Once again, then, it's no surprise they dropped out and didn't return until 2018. Their second campaign was much better, and they started well and proved competitive in the bottom half of the table. However, after passing a preliminary round in 2022, they lost all games in the semi-final round there. Okay, Asian Cup. An overview of the Asian Cup. Guam entered the Asian Cup well before the World Cup, as we saw, but the results foreshadowed the humiliation they would suffer in the World Cup. In all 3 campaigns from 1996 to 2004, they lost all games and suffered heavy losses at the hands of even the weakest teams in the world, to say nothing of the double-digit scorelines against stronger teams. So their case in particular made it clear that another tournament was needed for weaker teams, and that came in the form of the AFC Challenge Cup, started in 2006. Even here, though, they lost all games by large score lines, and after 2 editions, they dropped out. Perhaps to avoid further embarrassment. But it was not much better when they returned in 2014. The scorelines were a bit more respectable, and they earned their first regional cup win by beating Chinese Taipei. All teams returned to a newly formatted Asian Cup in 2019, where a 2018 World Cup qualifying doubled as the first 2 rounds. As we saw, they had done relatively well there, but though they earned advancement to the final round, they withdrew, citing financial constraints as the reason. In 2023, they didn't reach that final round, round 3 of 3. Their World Cup qualifying campaign left them in a playoff to reach it, but they lost both legs. We'll look at that under the recent campaigns, though. And as a result, they're going to be playing in the 2024 Solidarity Cup. Yeah. Oh, so, okay. Sorry, I got a bit mixed up there. Okay. Again, we'll come back to that in the recent campaigns. At the local cup, their regional group is the East Asian Football Federation. That federation consists of 10 countries. The final tournament always includes the strongest 3 in the region, which are South Korea, Japan, and China. And then North Korea and Hong Kong vie for the 4th spot. The other teams are quite weak. Guam, Mongolia, Chinese Taipei, Macau, and as of 2008, the Northern Mariana Islands. Those are too weak to challenge to reach the final tournament, but the qualifying rounds themselves do offer them competition at their own level. In early editions, Guam was no competition even among these teams, and they finished last in qualifying in all 5 editions from 2003 to 2013. But from 2010, they did start to challenge these weak teams in the preliminary rounds. And in 2015, they finished ahead of Chinese Taipei in the main qualifying group. By 2019, they were regularly passing a preliminary round, but actually fell at that stage, a bit disappointingly, because they were improving a little bit there. Okay, well, they don't have much of a World Cup history, having not entered most tournaments, but we will do a deep dive nevertheless. The first World Cup entry in 2002 really was a nightmare. It began with a 19-0 loss to Iran, and that was humiliating enough, but at least it was at the hands of a major team. However, a 16-0 loss to Tajikistan perhaps convinced them that they were not ready for such competitions, and ultimately they stayed away until 2018. So they withdrew in 2006 and in 2010. In 2010, they were scheduled to play Indonesia, but they withdrew after that draw had been made. 2014, they just simply didn't enter. So that brings us all the way to 2018. And inexplicably, they received a bye in the preliminary round, somehow not ranked as one of the 12 weakest teams in the region. So we've seen in other with other teams that something was really weird about that FIFA ranking in 2018, with some weak teams getting a bye and some reasonably strong teams having to play the preliminary round. Them being, they were mildly competitive in their local cup, and I guess that earned them enough points to raise their rank, but really they should have been in the preliminary round. Nevertheless, they did prove worthy of the bye by winning their first two games in the group stage over Turkmenistan and India, both at home. So a bit of a surprise there. They also impressively tied Oman, but they lost all road games and finished fourth or fifth in the group ahead of India. The winner of the group was Iran, but they avoided the thrashing of 2002, losing each leg 6-0 here, so relatively mild compared to the scoreline in 2002. 2022 began with a loss to feeble Bhutan in the preliminary round, and I think I'm jumping the gun here because we're going to cover that in the recent section, which actually we move on to next. So again, we begin the recent round with the 2019 Asian Cup. So 2018 World Cup qualifying made up the first two rounds of qualification here, and we saw that they finished fourth of five in that group ahead of India, and that saw them through, as far as the Asian Cup goes, to the third round. But you'll see that there is no third round for Guam. Despite the good campaign, they withdrew before round three started, citing financial constraints as the reason. So that's kind of too bad, because they were in relatively good form around 2019. I doubt they would have reached the Asian Cup, but they could have been a bit competitive after that good second round in 2018 World Cup qualifying. The next tournament was the EAFF Cup, their local cup in 2019, and they beat Northern Mariana Islands in the opening game there, winning 4-0. And they tied Mongolia, scoring what seemed a winner at the 89th minute, only to be scored upon 4 minutes into injury time. And in the other game, they lost to Macau. So overall, they finished third in the preliminary group. Again, a bit of a disappointing result, not only because they were looking stronger around that time, but because they had actually, at the local level, never fallen in the preliminary stage before. Okay, World Cup 2022 then was their next campaign, and this time they were one of the 12 bottom-ranked teams required to undergo the preliminary round, and they lost the first game in Bhutan, but they won heavily 5-0 in the home leg to advance from the preliminary round. They were no match in the second round, though, even against fourth-seeded Maldives, and they lost all games to them, as well as to, or I should say, lost both games to Maldives and all games, in fact, to Syria, China, and Philippines to finish dead last in that group. Okay, next tournament was the EAFF Cup, or the East Asian Cup, the local cup, and I've expressed surprise over this in other media casts here, that there was no qualifying for this tournament. So I'll just repeat what I said, which is Asia is probably the best region in terms of offering something for weak teams. They were the first to do it, and they have some clever ways of providing games for the weaker teams in the region. So it comes as a surprise that in this 2022 East Asian Cup, they just didn't bother with qualifying anymore, but just appointed the top 4 ranked teams into the final tournament. And of course, that's always been Japan, China, South Korea, and one other team. So Guam and the weaker teams in the region kind of lost their opportunity for the qualifying campaign. And I think that's a real shame. It's not like Asia to do that. CONCACAF does stuff like that, and it's upsetting. So it's a bit upsetting to see that here too. Anyway, so the Asian Cup in 2023 is the last tournament we'll look at. And again, that began with the World Cup rounds in 2022 World Cup qualifying. And we saw that in the second round there, they lost all games and finished last behind Philippines and Maldives. So here we look at the clever system that Asia has for teams that don't do well. They went on to a kind of a round 2 of 3 playoff. So they get a couple of cracks at reaching the final round, but they lost that playoff, losing both legs to Cambodia. I guess in 2019 they got a couple of cracks to reach round 3, but in this one they didn't, just that playoff. And because they lost that playoff, they qualified for the 2020 Solidarity Cup, keeping in mind that these qualifying campaigns take place a couple of years before the tournament. They would have played in the 2020 Solidarity Cup, except that the tournament was cancelled due to COVID. So that tournament for the teams knocked out early in qualifying didn't take place. Okay, and that is the end of part 2, our look at both teams. So now we'll kind of look at them in comparison to each other, and we begin with the pots that they came from. So the bottom 20 teams were divided into 2 pots. So pot 2 with the bottom 10 teams, and pot 1 with the other 10 teams. And Singapore came in at 33rd in the Asian region, so they were around the middle of pot 1. And ranked at that time 158th in the world in the FIFA rankings. In pot 2, Guam came from pot 2, and actually they were the second lowest ranked team in Asia when this was decided. So 45th in Asia and 203rd in FIFA rankings there. And the FIFA rankings are slightly different in their most recent ranking. So Singapore is the same at 158th and Guam is 206th. So Guam about 50 points behind there. And it's pretty similar in the ELO rankings too. Singapore is ranked 170 and Guam is ranked 217. So both of them roughly 15 points, or both of them roughly 10 points behind what they are in FIFA, but the difference between them is the same. So the two systems kind of agree on their relative strengths. The head-to-head doesn't give us much information, as the two have never met each other. We only look at World Cup and Asian Cup here. We're thinking of including the local tournaments, but of course these two are from different localities, so wouldn't meet there either. So this will be their first meeting. And then finally we look at the odds, and we see Singapore. Now this is actually just the first game, so Singapore playing at home, and they have a 93.5 chance of winning that game. So heavy favorites here over Guam, who have just a 3.7% chance of winning. We won't get into the mathematics of why that doesn't add up to 100%, but it does kind of show us what the odds makers are thinking. It's unfortunate that we couldn't find odds to kind of win over the course of two games, but I honestly would imagine it's something similar to this, maybe 90% and 10%, and even that might be being generous to Guam. So let's just finish with a bit of a discussion. Obviously, this is a fairly one-sided battle here, so it would be really a shock if Guam took anything here. in fact, it's one of the most one-sided sets of the preliminary round. And Singapore is really not a preliminary round team, and they're only here because the field for preliminary teams was expanded from 12 in 2018 and 2022 to 20 teams in 2026. And when they do that, when they expand the preliminary field too much, it creates one-sided pairings like this, and it gives the weaker team very little chance. So few teams could have less chance than Guam here, who at one point in their history required, you know, almost a new tier for teams because they were being thrashed even by the weakest teams in the region. They did actually get better around 2018, and as we saw, they did put in a fourth tier performance, and I mean, even that probably wouldn't make them competitive here, but they have fallen back, and they now once again seem a fairly weak fifth tier team. I would say at the lower end of the fifth tier team. In fact, we saw in the pots there that they were considered the second weakest team in Asia. So they likely will kind of lose this preliminary round then and go to the Solidarity Cup in 2025 because they stand almost no chance here, and Singapore will move on to the second round and probably are too strong a team to finish last there. They usually finish third or fourth in the group. So a really one-sided affair here. And of course, our prediction is that Singapore will be the team to go through. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of set 3, Singapore versus Guam. And we look forward to meeting you when we look at set 4. That is Myanmar versus Macau. We would like to thank Pixabay and Amaxi for the use of the music in this series titled Caledon or Caledon Flute Beat.